Hello, Internet. This is Billy Rothard, aka Rothgar, coming at you with another episode of Deep Listens. As you might be aware, our good friend and fearless leader, Gino, that Pinguino Greco, is not going to join us for this podcast, but no less, we will continue on in his absence. I am joined, as always, by Peter, Hegelian Dialectics Busby.
Perfect. Something I know almost nothing about, but works all the same. Hello, everybody. Like Billy told you, we're man down on this podcast, but hopefully, we'll be at least as good, if not better, for it.
Yeah, so if you want to get in touch with the show, you can hit us up on Twitter and other social media at DeepListensPod. You can send us an email at our email address, deeplistenspodcast@gmail.com. You can also hit us up on our primary hosting site, deeplistens.libsyn.com. We're also hosted on some other podcast websites. You can also check us out on iTunes, where you can get the show, leave comments, rate 5 stars, all the good stuff. We love hearing from you. Gino did not mention that there was any feedback that I should go over, though he might have some in his back pocket for when he does return. But that should be the general intro stuff. Today we're going to be talking about Pete's pick, which is an interesting platforming game called Circa Infinity. So without any further ado, Pete, why don't you take us off and play the role of Billy and give us the story summary of Circa Infinity.
All right, I can do that. So Circa Infinity, this is a fairly easy one for a story summary. You play a nondescript, either seemingly male or seemingly female in the sort of stereotypic gender roles we like to think of way. One has long hair, the other one doesn't. And your job is basically to navigate through these series of concentric circles. You basically jump to the next layer, hitting a smaller circle that brings you to the next one, the next, the next, the next. Eventually you fight these boss fights. You get through enough circles, you meet up with your doppelganger, basically. So one of them's white, the other one's black. And you sort of continue to navigate as a pair, as a duo, until ultimately things just sort of explode into a kaleidoscopic ride of color.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow,
that's it, right?
you fucking nailed it, man.
100%
perfect story explanation.
Mm-hmm.
So this game definitely borrows from elements of classical platformers, classical puzzle games, dips into the realm of more modern day HTML browser-based, like Flash games, puzzle games, platforming games. But this game was built with a very minimalist design and presented to an audience, I think, in the package of something that is going to take on a newer and exciting, framework, or in some ways take those two smaller genres somewhere new. I think one of the major points that we're going to examine today is whether or not this game achieves that goal. So let's start with just a little bit of mechanical discussion. This game basically only has 2 buttons: move and then interact. So the movement is interesting. Why don't you talk a little bit about the way this sort of left and right movement works, Pete?
Right. So like I said, right, in a traditional platformer, right, you're running, well, if we're talking super traditional platformer, you're just running to the right. But for the most part, it's just left and right. You're dealing on these sort of horizontal planes. What happens here is you're operating within these concentric circles. So as you run across, you sort of loop in or out. And then like I said earlier, you jump to the next one. So it's your job to sort of operate within both inside and outside isn't really right. Like, it works inside and outside of these circles to avoid enemies on both sides. So you're basically just running in circles, but it's like if you know anything about Ring World, it's like you're operating on Ring World. Like it has that own internal gravity to it.
Right. So similar, to another, monumental and classic game that we played, Halo. The Halo rings are also built as a massive circle, and the gravity is with respect to the perimeter of that circle.
Exactly.
So what I found interesting, and actually one of the first things that I do whenever I play a game, is go into the menu and see what the different options are for like mechanical configurations. and you can actually change the left and right programming to be inverted if you want to. Now, all that really means is so there's going to be a time in the game where you are pushing right and your character moves left from the player's perspective, because you're going to be inverted, either on top of a circle or on the bottom of a circle. Now you can switch it so that if your character is standing on the bottom inside of a circle, they move left to right with respect to your keyboard or your controller. Or if they're on top of the circle, they move left to right with respect to your keyboard. So it's really a choice of, do you want your character to be on top of the circle when the controls seem backwards, or on the bottom of the circle when your controls seem backwards?
A very important decision for any real gamer.
Any real platformer.
You can also change. So it doesn't really matter that much. Did you change the color scheme?
You could, and I'm glad that you could, but I feel like that was sort of an afterthought.
Yeah.
What kind of color schemes were there?
I don't even know. I know you could change it, but it seemed to me like the whole premise of the game is built on this sort of black. So they only use 3 colors basically until you get to later levels. You have black and white for the concentric circles, and then you have red for enemies. And really the game sort of, its aesthetic, its story, the minimal bit that it has that we'll get to, I think it's all based on this black-white contrast, right? Like if you look at a color wheel, like, I don't know, since they come up later, blue and orange are across from each other, but they don't have the sort of visceral impact white and black have in terms of contrast.
Right. And I think that there's a lot to be said when a game chooses to go super minimalist on one aspect of its design. It almost demands that they flesh out something else more to compensate. I think in a lot of ways, this game actually didn't achieve that goal very well.
Yeah, this is a game, like, just to feed off your point, Billy, it was similar in certain respects to, oh hell, I forgot what it's called
Devil
now.
Daggers?
No, I was going to say Thumper.
Thumper, okay.
Because, like, Thumper's another game that its aesthetic, it's not minimalist, but it is sort of within, it has set parameters, right? Like, you're not going to go far afield in your Thumper environments. So what comes in more there is the music. And I thought this was a game that could have benefited from, it's not a bad soundtrack, but it's not one that carries the action in the same way Thumper does.
Right. It doesn't do quite enough work.
There's not enough juice there.
I think one of the best things about the game was the music, but I'll still say it was only a passable soundtrack. Like, I certainly don't want to put any. Actually, I'll rephrase that. I say that the soundtrack was its best aspect. There was nothing wrong with it. It was just strictly positive. There was nothing bad about the soundtrack, but it can't do enough work on its own.
Yeah, this is a case where your minimalist aesthetic establishes something, and then the soundtrack has to then build off that. It doesn't want to overtake it, but in this case, it was passable. It didn't do that building work.
Like, Thumper could have been made, the exact game as far as the mechanics is concerned, could have been made in like an HTML Flash game with just squares and triangles and circles and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And what that game would have been missing was Thumper's rich music impact, because the music was not just fun to listen to. It was well-made music, but it synergized with its environment. There was like beats and bangs and crashes that aligned with what you were doing in game, and the music did it too. So it felt like almost like a movie soundtrack.
Yeah, and I think that means one part where this game just sort of, I don't know, didn't necessarily. There's a point at which minimalism has diminishing returns, I guess is the best way to put it.
Right. You start going so minimal that there's actually not enough to start a fire at that point. Like,
sure, in that well-known metaphor that everybody uses.
I mean, like, how small. I mean, I guess I didn't use the metaphor very well, but like, if you want to,
like, you haven't gathered enough tinder, we need more wood. I get it.
Let's think about baking a cake. Like, how much can you remove before you just have a bowl of flour? And that's not a cake anymore.
See, that one works better. That one's good.
So, breaking down as much of the mechanics as possible, we do have this one, or I should say two interactions: moving your characters, and then an interact button, which if you are on the inside of a circle, where you are, sort of closer to the circle center, it acts as a jump, and you can jump inside the circle. If you are on the outside of a circle, you don't have that. You have like a crouch, sort of like a ground pound, but you stay stationary on the. Sorry, I shouldn't say stationary. You stay connected to the circumference of the circle at all times.
Yeah, you just slide.
It's sort of
Basically,
a slide.
they're floating enemies you slide beneath.
Right. So that added a bit of mechanical depth. That in the very beginning of the game, you see that move as only the move that lets you enter into a circle at the proper location where a circle may be crossed into. But in like the second or third out of the game's 5 grand total levels, each level is cut into, I think, 10 pieces. So there's like something like
50 mini units.
Yeah, like 50 mini discrete levels, but there's like 5 overall worlds.
Mm-hmm.
And the worlds are really only defined by what enemies there are and what music is playing.
Yeah, I mean, they're all just circles.
And, well, I guess there's slightly different colors because orange and blue, I think, come in like much later, but I digress. You only have moving left and right and either ground pound sliding or jumping inside of the circles. So that's all you get. That's the exhaustive list of the mechanics of this game.
Now, it is complicated, like Billy sort of alluded to, in later levels where they introduce a secondary character. So you're controlling both of these characters at the same time. Like I said, one's white, one's black. So the way they interact with these circles changes a little bit. They can only enter on certain color, and we'll call them pie slices, or enemies only show up in certain color pie slices as well. And they're always on opposite ends, exactly 180 degrees away from each other on this circle. So you control both of them at once. You have to sort of navigate those color shifts. And like you said, later on in the last world, you get blue and orange introduced as well. So your characters can shift colors when they pick up what are basically power-ups on the outside or inside of the circle.
Right. So we get, out of the 5 levels, level 1 is just one of your character, like one half of the character pair. Level 2 introduces the second half of the character pair. Level 3 puts them together for the first time. Level 4 is... Does level 4 the level where they switch which direction they're going, so they're going opposite, or is that level 5?
I think that's 5. There's 5 just blue. 5's definitely blue and orange.
Blue and orange, yeah.
I think 4's where the colors inside the circle start to shift and stuff too, right?
Oh, okay, yeah. I'm kind of forgetting the end, but there's a simple progression of how this content flows.
Each world basically adds one more layer of depth.
Right, one more layer of depth. And at the end of this game, we do have, I guess, like a pretty challenging platformer puzzle game.
Yeah.
But overall, I think it's actually lacking quite a bit. And
I'd agree with you, especially if you came in looking for like a hardcore fast twitch platformer.
Right.
Because the further into the game you go, the less you get of that.
Now, I want to ask sort of a specific question, which is, who is this game trying to appeal to?
Good question.
What is the target demographic of this game? Now, in some earlier podcasts, and this is some information and ideas that I learned while I was at a PAX convention 2 years ago. This is kind of old, but it was an idea that stuck with me, that there are these 3 general areas of gamers, and they're not mutually exclusive. There can be a Venn diagram where there's overlap, but the first area, and this is in no particular order, but I should say one area is a demographic of gamers that are focused on things like immersion and story exploration. They want that creative world. They want that sensory immersion. A second area of gamer is the demographic that looks for mastery and achievement, and they want to see numbers go up, and they want to see leaderboards, and they want to see the fastest times, and they want to see beating a really difficult, challenging, punishing, experience of a game. And there's this third demographic that seeks the social aspect, the competitive aspect, the community aspect that you would find in lots of online multiplayer games, sports games, fighting games, shooting games, team-based games like MOBA or Counter-Strike and stuff like that. So I'm struggling to find out which demographic this game is aiming towards, because at face value, this game I think is trying to appeal to the demographic of mastery and achievement, presenting to them sort of a hard puzzle game and saying, you have earned a certain skill or done some kind of achievement by beating this game. But I don't think it's actually good enough at that job that it would appeal to this demographic of gamers. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think, the obvious thing you first have to keep in mind is that the game is timing you, right? Like, we get a time.
There's a timer
and
and a death counter.
That's the other thing too, right? So there's basically two major achievements. I shouldn't even say two major. There are two achievements in this game, two things you can do. You can go as fast as possible, right? And that goes sort of hand in hand. You get a slight reward for not dying. If you just stay alive the whole time, you get a little tick on your marker. The game says, good job, way to go. But unless you're super committed to speed running, that's, it's like you said, that's really not going to hold your attention for that long. Just seeing how much lower and lower you can get this number to go. Just so we can get sort of the mechanics out there, is there a leaderboard of any sort? I don't remember seeing one like Devil Dagger style or anything.
I didn't see one, but I also didn't really look for one. This game really didn't catch my attention long enough for me to break apart those pieces of the game.
Yeah, I don't think there was. Even if there were, though, I mean, like I said, it'd just be numbers going down.
It really doesn't. It really is not that interesting. And I would agree that Devil Daggers suffered from that same kind of pitfall, although it offered a bit more in that it did have this creepy vibe, a very interesting first-person shooter aspect. Devil Daggers was a game that you just play through once, and when you die, and your leaderboard shows up. But that game, I think, achieved more than Circa Infinity does, because, and I guess I'll add something else to this as well. We get 5 overarching levels, and within each of those 5 overarching levels, 10 discrete miniature levels, and I believe level 10 is the boss fight. Maybe it's 10 levels and then a boss fight, but that's neither here nor there. I don't know this for 100% certain, but from what I experienced about the game is each level from the very start is already sort of like set in motion. So in theory, a computer could just be programmed to run through the correct route of Circa Infinity.
Oh, as in regardless of what circle you're on, they're all operating initially.
Right, they all spawn with the same configuration. And so if you were to have a computer hooked up to a controller, the computer could be unaware of what's happening on the screen, but input the right set of commands that would take you to the end of Circa Infinity. The only thing that I don't know is if the boss fights are like that. The boss fights might have some elements of randomness, but the other levels, every single enemy behaves in a very predictable way. The only thing that adds difficulty to the game is the player, being able to manage all of their patterns at once, which is difficult for us, especially in a circular, inverted world.
Yeah.
But for a computer that's not looking at that and can just have the correct route programmed, I think a computer could just beat Circa Infinity in the fastest time with 0 deaths. I think that there is just a bottom line fastest time.
Part of the problem too, and I think it's related, is that, and this goes into that sort of platform or the puzzler shift we were talking about earlier, is that a lot of the game, especially in later levels, boils down to just sort of waiting patiently. Like as these circles are moving inside circles, if you just wait to enter for the right time, you're safe on the outside, you enter, jump once, and the circle's beaten. It's just about picking that moment, which isn't really exciting, especially if you're platforming.
Exactly. I mean, a lot of the excitement of platforming is
constant movement.
Is constant movement, fluidity of movement, progression through a world, and I think Circa Infinity does something interesting, which is breaks a norm of a typical platformer of the sort of left to right level progression, where
Mhm.
we're seeing a new background over and over. In this case, we're sort of diving into this cone, into this like I don't know how you would describe it, but the sort of like hypnotic um, abyss of concentric circles within concentric circles within concentric circles. So it keeps on getting deeper and deeper and deeper into this pit essentially of circles. And that's kind of interesting, but it's about as far as the platforming elegancy goes.
Yeah, it's novel to see something that's operating with a different geometry. But again, this is a case where gimmickry can only take you so far.
So I
You have to
ask,
have something further.
if there is, and at some point by a computer perhaps, a measurable perfect run. Now, granted, I don't know for certain that this could be done. Just my initial experience of the game suggests it. I think if anything were to break that from being possible, it would be the 5 boss fights because they might not be programmable. There
Hmm.
might be some aspects of RNG that a computer program cannot deal with within those boss fights, but I'm pretty sure within the 45 other discrete levels there is. So we're really, really freaking close to this being just a a a formula that gets the best time and lowest life. Sorry, gets the best time with 0 deaths.
I wonder though if that might just be a problem with platformers in general.
It might because you can sort of do that for the old school Mario games.
That was going to be my example, right? Is if you just input commands at the appropriate speed in Mario, it'll still work.
Yeah,
I
and
mean,
actually,
Mario's objectively better, but all the same.
well, there's a reason why it's objectively better. I mean, there. No, we can get a little bit academic here because
Sure.
there's an element of choice in a Mario game. There really is no element of choice in Circuit Infinity. It's completely linear. In Super Mario 3, for example, which I think is the best example of that genre of game at that time, Super Mario Bros. 3 for the
I like
NES.
Mario World better, but
All right, fair, but I think the one that I've had the most experience with is Super Mario Bros. 3,
okay.
and I actually saw as part of an Awesome Games Done Quick run, like an AGDQ or something like that,
Yeah.
they actually had 4 different Mario games that were all beatable using the same input of commands.
Wait, when you say 4 different Mario, do you mean like Super Mario World, Super Mario 3?
Yeah, like 4 different Mario games
Okay.
that one computer could use one program on
And play
4 controllers
simultaneously?
and play simultaneously and beat all 4 of those games
That's
at
actually
very
super
close to
cool.
the same time. Now, it spent a lot of that game with like Mario just like running into a wall because some other game was doing something, but eventually they would like sync back up and move, and that's really, really cool.
That is really cool.
It also breaks down the Mario games a lot. But what
That's super cool. Like that's super cool, but in one of those ways they're just like, all right, like why'd you take the time to figure this out though?
it
Like
probably
I'm
took
glad you did. I was entertained by it, but
it
why?
probably took teams of people
I
to
know.
do that.
So much time.
Like hundreds of hours and teams of people to do this. But I mean, we're getting off track.
Yeah.
What saves the Mario games is that route doesn't experience the full game. There's like secret levels and hidden worlds, and there's choices. So like in
True.
Super Mario Bros. 3, there's parts of the map that can be like broken to access a new world, or you can use a whistle to fly to a new place and choose what level you go to. So there's not just one linear path through a Mario game. You can jump around worlds and have a different gameplay experience each time.
And even I mean, I just again building. Even if we set aside that, right? Like even if we think, all right, maybe we don't want to ask for secret worlds here. At the very least, there is a variance in play styles. Like if you want to, if I just because I like Super Mario World, right? If you want to ride Yoshi, if you want to get the cape, if you want to spew fireballs, you can play that game different ways, and it's going to change the run. Whereas, like you said in Circa Infinity, there's only one way. Like everybody who beats Circa Infinity is going to do it exactly the same way.
Yeah. So where a game can be programmed such that there's really no so that there could be a best route or an optimal route. That exists for a Mario game, but there's more to the game than that.
Yeah.
In Circa Infinity, there's not more to the game than that. And I think this part of Circa Infinity would probably make it unattractive for the demographic of player that is in that mastery achievement, because the person who's in the mastery achievement category wants to do something unique and faster and better.
Mm-hmm.
But it's almost unappealing if there is just an objectively best way. If there is really only one way and there's no experimenting with how it can be optimized, there is just a solution and it comes too quickly, so that there's not that enjoyment of optimizing a route or like finding a gimmick or a trick. It's almost taking away what that demographic is actually looking for. So who's left to play this game?
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason. There's a reason tic-tac-toe gets boring as hell once you figure it out.
It's solved.
And I think this is where the minimalism comes back into play, right? Because I think you could say the same general thing about, and I'm ashamed of myself for forgetting the name of the game. What's the name? What's the game with the squares?
Thomas Was Alone.
Thomas Was Alone. Thank you. I love how all I have to say is the game with the squares. So in Thomas Was Alone, it's probably the same deal, right? There's one route, basically, more or less, let's say, through all the levels, right? So again, you could just program that through. But the important thing about Thomas Was Alone is there's an atmosphere, there's a story, there's a humor there that can carry it. So even as you're just sort of moving through things unidimensionally, you're still invested, you're still entertained, you're still engaged, because it hasn't cut everything else out of that unidimensionality.
And so if we talk about like solved games, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're bad,
No.
because the introduction of another player can mitigate that greatly. So for example, I don't know if there's a 2-player Circa Infinity, but if this game had a 2-player, it'd probably be a much better experience. Now, it kind of takes away from the like the polarized symmetry of the two player characters needing to be 180 degrees apart.
Yeah.
But if there were the inside player and the outside player, that would be pretty cool. There's other games that do that. I forget what they're called. Some of my friends have played this cool game where there's like a mirror world and you can interact with the other person's image of your world to help them get through the platformer, but I forget what it's called. That kind of stuff is cool, but it was left out here.
I think you're right though. That thing you said to begin with is that, and I'm sure we'll get to the story, but if you allowed that sort of interaction, I think it would undermine a lot of what this game's trying to do. Which ultimately, I mean, I think it would, like you said, make for a more interesting game, but it wouldn't necessarily be what I would say the game the developers wanted, or at least the message the developers wanted to send.
Right. And there's a lot of solved games. We've got Tic-Tac-Toe is solved, Checkers is solved, Nine Men's Morris is solved.
What is Nine Men's Morris?
It's the game that you play in Assassin's Creed 3.
Oh, cool, great, gotcha.
But it's a real board game. It's like a real pieces game.
Is Othello solved?
I don't think Othello is solved.
Well, when we make our pivot to a board game podcast, I'm sure we'll find out.
Yeah, definitely. Some games are partially. Oh no, I'm looking at a list now. Othello is considered partially solved.
Okay. So there's an optimal strategy, but it's not irrespective of what the other person does.
It's because Othello gets less and less solved the more board you add. It gets more and more solved
gotcha.
the smaller the board gets.
Gotcha.
So
we should just for the sake of our listeners, when we say something like checkers is solved, what it means is that if you play checkers the correct way, the prescribed way, regardless of what your opponent does, you still win. There's an optimal strategy that will win 100% of the time it is played correctly.
And a game can be solved even if there's technically not a winner. It could be also solved if you force a draw. For
like
example,
tic-tac-toe.
Tic-Tac-Toe is the example where 2 players that don't make a serious mistake will always end the game in a draw.
Mm-hmm.
chess is notoriously not quite solved yet. There are
Right.
some areas of chess that would be considered like pseudo solved.
Yeah, there's a long opening theory, and the end game especially. Like once you have like let's say two rooks or two bishops and a king on a board, what it means is that there's a prescribed series of moves you should play.
Right. So, yeah, there are parts of chess that are solved such that you can choose an objectively best move, and it can result invariably to you winning the game or your opponent losing the game or drawing or something.
Yeah.
So, getting off this topic for a little bit, I don't want to bash Circa Infinity for just that too
No,
much.
like we said, it's an interaction of that and this decision to cut out so much other aspects of game.
Now, I wanted to take just a slightly different turn and say, does this, and I'm going to take sort of a weird jump here, but one of the first concepts that we talked about in Deep Listens was, what makes a game a game?
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if Circa Infinity would count as a game.
Okay.
And
Tell us why not, Billy.
and if I said Circa Infinity doesn't count as a game, I would just say that it is a puzzle, just like your a Sudoku is a puzzle, or a line and pencil maze is a puzzle, or one of those like sliding images is a puzzle. That would be considered loosely a game, but I'm not sure if Circa Infinity meets all the requirements to count as a video game. Now, for our listener base that isn't maybe as knowledgeable on the academic definition of video game, and I'm not that caught up either, but there are some loose requirements and some commonly understood requirements, but there really isn't a good definition for what objectively are the necessary and sufficient conditions for a video game. Though
No.
those are still open to interpretation and speculation.
But I mean, how many necessary and sufficient definitions are there in the world, really?
I mean, if we're gonna get really messy, we'll be here all day, but we don't
Yeah,
need to be.
there are probably none. But
They
it's a
exist.
good question to ask
Yeah.
regardless.
They exist pretty okay in the realms of math and science. They exist pretty okay in some poetry and literature because, like, a haiku it has necessary and sufficient conditions to be a haiku.
That's true.
But I don't want to go too deep into the definition of what makes a game, but I think if Circuit Infinity can just be programmed with one solution, and again, I have to reiterate, I'm not 100% sure it can because I haven't dug that deep into it, but if it did have just a programmable solution, and it didn't have options like the Super Mario games do of like exploring different paths of the world just because you want to,
Or at the very least, playing it differently.
or at the very least choosing to play it differently, if there is really only one way to play Circuit Infinity such that it is the best playthrough, does it now get removed from the realm of a game and just become a puzzle? Kind of like how a crossword or a line and pencil maze has one correct solution.
That's a good question, Billy. That might be one of those questions we can't answer.
I mean, I want to pick it apart a little bit because there still is the aspect of video game. It is, it was made by presumably a games company. It was made. I'll look up who made Circa Infinity so I can properly name them.
It's still, while you're looking it up too, it's still reflex dependent in a way that like a crossword puzzle isn't.
Well,
so there is some sort of presence of skill in terms of just reaction time.
But so the developer's name is Kenny Sun.
Okay.
So sorry, Kenny, if I'm bashing your work, but it's all for academic love.
But I guess
going back to the point is if a computer can program its way through Circuit Infinity, it doesn't have to be observing the game state. It doesn't have to be observing the board. Right? Is it really a puzzle if a computer can look at the pieces? Sorry, is it really a puzzle if there's no image and doesn't require like piece orientation? Probably, because if there's no image but a computer could just like feel the edges and know what goes together, I'd still call it a puzzle, a boring puzzle, right?
And I mean, my argument from reaction time is probably specious to begin with. I mean, because really, if you think about like a crossword puzzle, like trivia knowledge or just like knowledge of crossword puzzles, I guess, would be the analog for reaction time. So then the question becomes, all right, what makes reaction time inherently more gamey than, trivia knowledge, let's say?
And there are some games that don't give a shit about reaction time, like any turn-based RPG,
Sure.
kind of like Persona 5.
Ooh, nice plug.
I mean, Persona 5 has some elements of reaction time because you gotta get in those batting cages,
Sure.
but in a turn-based RPG combat system, you have unlimited time to think about your choice.
And it can't be spatial awareness either, because I mean that's probably the skill that's involved in like a jigsaw puzzle. There's just awareness of how these various pieces fit together.
It's pretty hard to fight in favor of Circa Infinity, and I think its minimalist design is the reason why it's hard to defend it. Again, if you take so much away from a game, it can become something beautiful. We know that we've seen simple and beautiful games like Thomas Was Alone, like Thumper, Devil Daggers. Thomas probably the best of those games that I just mentioned, but
I'd say so.
we've even played other games that were simple, like Undertale. I think is a very rudimentary
To the
graphic.
Moon.
Yeah, to the Moon was a rich story with an 8-bit, essentially the kind of graphics you saw in the original Pokemon games.
Or what was the one we played with the interrogation and you watched the videos?
That was Her Story. Again,
Her
I don't think I would call Her Story a game.
No, but it's I think it's more interesting in its minimalism
Yeah,
than
it's like a
Circa
visual
Infinity.
novel sort of thing. I mean, I guess if a dating simulator video game can count, Her Story probably counts.
You know, we should get more dating sims.
Throwing out Hatoful Boyfriend next, it's
I'm
gonna be
saying
my.
another time Gino's not around because I don't think he'd like it, but we'll throw
Oh,
him
I
out.
think Gino would be so down for us to examine Hatoful Boyfriend as a real academic. And you know what? I've decided what I'm picking next. No, I'm just kidding. I'll let Gino pick the dating sim game.
All right.
So, in other, I mean, I'm not quite done picking this apart because I really
Okay.
really care about
Sure. Lay it on me.
um and I mean I don't want to get so like Aristotelian with like categories and
The
fucking
tripartite game.
yeah, like I don't want to go there, but
How does this game help us achieve eudaimonia?
yeah, I'm not flourishing while I'm playing Circa Infinity. Now also, we've played simple games that took visual aesthetics as its paramount feature.
Mm-hmm.
This game didn't do that. We've had games that took music
Well,
as its.
yeah, I'd say this game did take aesthetics as its paramount feature in terms of importance, not in terms of, let's say, time devoted. Right? So I think the black and white aesthetic informs the rest of the game. Like it's the unifying principle, but it's not perhaps the thing the developer devoted the most time or thought to, let's say.
I think it's quite frankly irritating.
All right. Okay. Well, we'll get to it when we circle back around the story. We'll bring this back up again.
Okay.
Right.
Because yeah, we're gonna talk about how the colors do stuff.
Yeah.
In the rest of the story, but I think that its visual aesthetic is irritating, and its attempt at minimalism ends up being a drawback of the game.
Yeah, I'd agree with you. I do think it backfires.
It could have been. I mean, it could have been so easy to say like, look, it's all going to be like concentric circles, but this is going to be like the underwater themed concentric circles, and there's red fish instead of like just creepy demon like imps throughout
Yeah,
the whole
'cause
game.
even the enemies, they don't behave differently. They're basically
don't.
just moving hitboxes.
Right, they're just moving hurt boxes, moving hit boxes, whatever. If they had like a forest concentric circle level, an outer space concentric circle level, a desert concentric circle level, where like the triangles were little pyramids and
Right.
stuff. It could have this game could have been made cuter, and it would have actually. I mean, like, it sounds weird because we don't want to reward developers for just being, I guess, in your words, twee.
Ooh, good one.
But like this game could have used a little bit of twee.
Yeah, at very least it could have used different environments.
I mean that. I mean, if Gino were here, he might give me the scolding like, "Well, Billy, you're not a developer. You don't know what it's like to have to code different levels." But I mean,
Well, we
I
can
feel
be
like
snide. He's not around.
I feel like the least you can give us is like a recolor. Like, I feel like it can't be that hard to change values and just make them slightly different colors. That
See,
can't be that hard.
again, I'm gonna come back on the color thing. I agree with you environments. I definitely agree with
Yeah.
you in enemies, but I'm gonna push back on color when
All
we
right.
get to it.
So I think I'll put the whole game thing to rest. I don't think Circa Infinity gets all the way there to count as a game, and if it does, it limps across the finish line. Like I said, maybe the boss battles having a little bit of randomness in them makes it not 100% programmable, but just the fact that it's like 5% not programmed doesn't absolve the
Yeah.
rest of the game from its just rote mechanical route through the game. When I'm looking for a platformer, I want there to be some RNG, some need for me to analyze and be reactive more than just having a complex pattern that my brain cannot process fast enough. But as long as I just keep repeating it over and over again, I'll just get through it. Similar sort of to the games like I Want to Be the Guy. You ever played those before?
No, I mean I'm aware of them, but
Yeah, they're just like a frustrating fit of memorization.
yeah.
And what's interesting though is that game is almost the same as Circa Infinity, but they have cool music and cool enemies and cool traps and cool themes and guest appearances by Mike Tyson, and like there's not just one way to go through that game. You could approach a trap and solve it one or two different ways.
I will say though, I've never picked up a game like I've never been playing like Fire Emblem, let's say my personal favorite series, and thought to myself, I really needed some more Mike Tyson in this one. Not high up on the list of my requirements.
So I'm done talking about whether or not Circa Infinity is a game. I think it doesn't count as a game or barely counts as a game. And as long as you look at it as a puzzle instead of a video game, I think if you come at it with that kind of mindset, you're going to have a slightly better experience. I was kind of left wanting because I thought this was going to be like a cool circle inverted based platformer.
I hope one day Circa Infinity gets a hardware release, just so they can put on the back of the box, not really a game, more of a puzzle. Billy
Yeah,
Rock. Like that's a great back cover blurb.
for sure, for
So,
sure. So
all right.
story,
Yeah, let me
more
do a
story.
little story. All right, so let me defend what I think Circa Infinity's doing here and why I think the color's so important. The black and
So,
white
someone
color.
has to.
Yeah, I know. I mean,
It's not going to be me.
I picked the game. It's my job. We can't just bash on it all day. So, like Billy mentioned at the beginning of our podcast when he did our jaunty nicknames, I think this game is really about a thing I know incredibly little about, but I'm going to reference it anyway. The Hegelian dialectic. All right, so it sounds fancy. I promise you it's really not, except when Hegel does it, it's a lot fancier than what I'm going to use it for right now. So the Hegelian dialectic has three parts, right? It's got thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis. So what that basically is, a thing, what seems to be that thing's opposite, and then they come together to form a new thing. So the thesis and its opposite, the antithesis, come together in a new thing, the synthesis. And I think that's what this game is really about, but it's applied to a personal story. And, it doesn't have to be, but I just read it as a romance because I'm, lovelorn and pathetic like that. So it's two characters, right, who are basically on opposite sides. They can never meet. They're always apart from each other. They have a perfect contrast, but eventually they come together and they produce a synthesis. And Billy, I think this is why the color dynamic, the aesthetic is so important, right? Because you have white and black, you have an obvious thesis and antithesis, but then when it comes together at the very end and you have that sort of kaleidoscope of color, that's when you get the synthesis, right? Because that's the only point when these two characters meet is at the end of the game. They come together and they produce something new, something incredible. Hegelian dialectic.
Drop the mic,
Right? What can
put
I
it on the billboard,
Now
ship it, pack it, we're good.
I hope we get some sort of feedback where somebody's like, listen, that's not at all what the Hegelian dialectic is about.
Please,
those
please, Deep Listens community.
those three terms worked super well here, so I had to do it.
I know, I know one of you out there is just an expert on Hegel and is just ready to write us a scathing email. And if you do, be sure to send it to deeplistenspodcast
Right.
at gmail.com and just light Pete up with his misinterpretation of Hegelian dialectic.
I want
But
Gino.
until then,
I want Gino to have to read like a rambling, like multi-page, but actually email on our feedback. That'd be glorious. But that's what I think's going on here, Billy.
all right, so I was playing this game and got as far as I did into it thinking that I was just playing a platformer and getting through. I still don't think it does enough. I can see where you're coming from with the intentionality. I think that the aesthetic has intention.
Hmm.
I'll grant it that, but it doesn't make up for what the game is missing. I think it was a cool idea. It probably still could have been accomplished if the game had like another aesthetic layer. I mean, I'm gonna just throw it out there again, like if it had like a water theme for one of its levels, forest theme, desert theme, space theme, whatever it is, snow theme, you can still have a dynamic of fire and ice, of forest and desert, of mountain and valley, of like what you can still have these visual aesthetics that would be on opposite sides of the color wheel
Yeah, no, I think
and mash them
fair,
together.
fair
That,
point.
although again, I'm not the one with the creative mind behind this game, but considering we really just had for like the first 60% of the game like an MS Paint color scheme, that's all we got.
Yeah.
Red, black, white. Then whoops, we get orange and blue, and then we just get the end of 2001: A Space Odyssey, and that's how and that's how the game ends.
And even, I mean, the interpretation I'm providing, while I think it's interesting, while I think it's compelling, it's a reading, it's an aesthetic that could have been produced in a, let's say 4 5 minute flash short. It didn't need, 5 levels of 10 mini levels each to accomplish this. There's not enough to sustain that.
I think that Circa Infinity would have done a lot better if it was a browser-based like Flash game.
Yeah.
I think that this draws me into the final point that I want to discuss, which something that we don't normally talk about on Deep Listens, but how was the marketing of this game? What is its price point, and how does that reflect what the market of indie games is trending towards?
Hmm.
I think when this game is not on sale, it's like $10. I'm just gonna confirm that,
Yeah. Take a look.
but I mean, I bought it during the Steam summer sale, so I paid like $3 for it. It was
Yeah.
really
Shout
cheap.
out the Steam Summer Sale, by
I
the way.
know, right? God, just destroy my wallet. Why don't
Deals on
you?
deals, though. Deals on
Yeah,
deals.
definitely. God, Gabe, chill the fuck out. Um, but when we think about a game's like inherent worth, looks like it's $5. It's $5.
Ordinarily.
I think it's ordinarily $5.
All right, that's more reasonable.
That's
That's
pretty
fair.
reasonable.
Yeah.
I think that is the
We
right
can't object to
yeah.
5.
I think that's the right price point.
Yeah.
There is Circa Infinity Deluxe Edition for $8, which includes the game and the soundtrack.
Okay. I don't know if that's worth $3, but all right.
Eh, debatable. Debatable. I like the soundtrack. The music was like I said, the music had no error
Yeah, it's
to
fine.
speak of. Really, there was no fault of the music. I think it didn't have quite enough to take the game all the way to completion.
Yeah.
But there seems to be this theme, this like trend happening of, especially on Steam, that somebody releases an indie game and there's a lot of support and love for indie games these days. In general, indie games are passion projects, and you can feel the kind of work and the kind of love that the developers put into these games. And I sense that there is love and work that went into place here. There's definitely some real effort that went into Circuit Infinity.
Yeah, if nothing else, it's at least an original idea. It could have been easy to just parrot somebody else, but he didn't,
Right.
and
This
props for that.
is this is a bit of an original idea.
Yeah.
So that's great. Is that worth dropping dollars for? That's a pretty hard question. Because as much as I want to say that, and this might be an unexpected response, one that you may not be anticipating, Pete, but as much as I want to say that a game not being that great isn't worth the dollars, I think we need to throw our money at the developers that are trying to be different and trying to be new,
Mm,
because it's so easy to adopt a model of a game and just recolor it, reskin, and sell it to the public. Number one most like redone and reskinned and resold game is like the Doom model.
yeah.
Like I think one of the original Doom games has been modded like 30 times and resold as like a different game,
Do you remember
or
when?
not necessarily sold, but like maybe like put up for free. But and like I actually saw a version of I think it was a Doom game that was Noah's Ark, and he was just trying to like incapacitate animals, not kill them, but he had like a slingshot that would be like sleep pellets and knock them out.
Do
But
you
he would
remember?
upgrade his slingshot to like the Gatling gun version of the slingshot and like the flamethrower version of his sleep pellet slingshot. So he'd just have to put all the llamas to sleep and get them to go into Noah's Ark.
Do you remember the one Czech Serial put out where it was like Doom, but you were some like sort of Czech's commando?
Yeah, I just there's been so many.
I for whatever reason I loved that one.
There's been so many. But back to my point. I I'm not upset that I paid money for Circa Infinity. I'm upset that Circa Infinity had a really good idea and it didn't take it quite all the way to completion. I
Mhm.
wish there was I wish there was more, but that's not going to stop me from dropping dollars for a cool indie idea because I'm going to want that cool indie community to feel support. I want there to be cool indie games.
All right, let
But
me. Yeah.
yeah, I don't know. I've just been ranting.
No, no, I think it's a legitimate point to make, and I want to sort of say two things. One, I think what you can see is that you can look to movies, right, where the sort of mid-tier movie has been largely squeezed out, sort of IP movies, right? Things that aren't based on existing intellectual property. So, things that aren't sequels or franchises have been squeezed out because instead what studios are doing is they're making huge bets on these really big budget blockbusters, and that's how they're making all their money. So I think you're right that once you sort of stop patronizing,
Or
once you
being a patron of.
yeah, patronizing seems wrong, but so once you stop being a patron of these sort of mid-tier ideas, right, of these sort of new indie ideas, people start making safer and safer bets, and that's what you'll see. You're getting crowd out. So while I think you're right, Billy, I think nonetheless it's difficult to ask individual consumers to subsidize indie games with their entertainment budget like that. I don't know I think there needs to be a solution. I just don't know if that's the one we want.
We have somewhat of a solution in the form of like Kickstarter and Patreon and things
Yeah,
that we can say like
we
here's
talked
a
about the
product.
shortcomings of that though, and sort of
Yeah,
what it necessitates for you to build.
true. Um, but I think one of the best votes we can cast today is where our dollar
Oh,
goes.
absolutely. I mean, that goes for anything, but
And
absolutely.
I want to say that Circuit Infinity left me wanting more, but I don't want this to dissuade any listener and it's certainly not going to dissuade myself from taking a plunge for $3 or $4 or even 8, 9, $10 for a cool new indie game experience. Maybe this particular one didn't do it for me, but it's not going to really change my little indie game small development firm or team ideas. Like I want to keep those intact, and I look forward to dropping a few bucks next week on a 2-3 hour long indie puzzle game maybe because I think there's a lot of worth there. It doesn't do enough for me.
And I want to say maybe that's the key, right? Is keeping that sort of price point reasonable. Because I mean, if you make a bet with $4 or $5 and it goes wrong, so be it. But then again, the difficulty becomes making that leap. Like, all right, how do you make then those mid games, right? Like, because if I drop $15 or $20 on a good idea that doesn't pan out, that's a price point at which I'm going to get upset. I'm now annoyed by this, and maybe I stick with something a little better known the next time.
So I think that I've said everything I want to say about that topic, but
Hmm.
Pete, if you don't mind, I think I just stumbled across something kind of interesting. I don't
Sure.
know if this takes the game in a new direction
Is it about Hegel?
for you. No, it's about Circa Infinity.
All right, what do we got?
Like when I opened up Steam, it was like, hey, you've got new items in your inventory. And I was like, oh, probably some trading cards. So I got some trading cards from Circa Infinity,
Ooh.
and the names of the Circa Infinity trading cards are like pictures of the monsters, and they have names of emotions like grief and joy. And I wonder if this is a hint at some other message or theme that the game is trying to promote. Maybe these monsters that we're dodging are representations of maybe emotional pitfalls or emotional ups and downs in a sort of cyclical form. I don't want to just completely derail us into a whole new discussion of the game, but maybe there's a little more commentary here behind the scenes. Again, I don't know if it was executed as well as it overall is meant. Like I think with like
Yeah.
a little more production, Circuit Infinity could have been a really cool puzzle game that delivered some really cool commentary or some really cool story. It just feels like it was finished before it reached its full potential.
Yeah, if you want to, like, I think if you want to bring in those sort of emotions, those sort of ideas, the circularity becomes a lot more, not necessarily interesting, but there's another layer to it, right? Where it's sort of these ideas like, listen, we all as individuals get caught in these cycles that are hard to break out of, right? And then maybe the two sides aren't necessarily a romantic relationship like I read, but maybe an interior thing. Like we're all trying to synthesize these antithetical parts of our own personality. But I think you're right that Steam trading cards are never the place to do that.
Yes, so the names of the Steam trading cards are Grief, Rage, Sloth, Joy, Lunacy, Torment, Fury, and Lethargy.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be more interesting if we had those facts up front, but there's nothing in the game itself that gives any indication of these relationships. There's nothing in the enemies themselves. That's like, at least in Dante's Inferno, like, he's sloth for a reason. Like,
Right.
he's wrath for a reason.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess some of the monsters cry,
That
but
one of the
like
bosses
that's
does.
it. Actually, I think two of them cry.
Yeah,
Well,
I think you're right.
neither here nor there, but like
Yeah, right. Either way,
they're either
it's
like
still not.
smiley monsters or like yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, at
What
any
was
rate,
your
not getting
what
it.
was your favorite what was your favorite and least favorite enemy type in this game?
I like the guys who would run really fast and then stop and then
Oh
start running
yeah.
really fast again. I like
Also, their names are Torment.
Yeah, they had spiky hair. That sounds about right.
Yeah, they were the spiky hair ones. I
Yeah.
like those a lot. I liked the ones that also their counterparts sucked. The ones that would only move in the air when you jumped.
Yeah.
Those were just those sucked.
Whatever.
I liked the ones that would like jump in a series. Like they
Oh,
would
yeah.
like
Okay.
jump it.
I know the ones
Yeah,
you're talking
they
about.
would like jump
And then you had to
in a
run on
linear
like
order. Yeah,
underneath
you
them.
like run underneath all of them as they're all jumping.
Yeah.
Those are called joy.
Oh, well, they jump.
They jump for joy.
I think that's it. Yeah.
Sweet. All right. Do you have any other major points you want to hit on for Circa Infinity?
I just before we go, just the title seems super weird. Circa Infinity, like approximately infinity, like around infinity. It doesn't make any sense.
Uh, yeah, I think it's just a title trying to be edgy and cool.
That's what I think, because I think they didn't want to call it Circle Infinity or like Infinite Circle.
Certainly don't want to do that.
So like, ooh, Circa.
Or
Yeah,
like Super Hexagon.
but
It's also just that game's actually kind of good, but not that different from Circa Infinity.
so I think basically the point here is, and I think we've made it, is Circa Infinity was in a lot of ways a cool idea, something interesting, something that breaks with platformer tradition, but there wasn't enough other stuff around this core kernel of good idea-ness to build something that was ultimately going to, I don't know, catch our eye or enthrall us.
Mm-hmm. So I think with that, I'm gonna go ahead and wrap up this episode. But now I've got a difficult choice because it's technically my pick,
It is. You're
and
up.
Gino's not here to stop me.
Ooh. Am I going to have to like dive on this grenade? Like, do I have to?
There's a couple games that are sort of just in my library that
Okay.
I would like to play.
All right.
Um, Let me take a look. I made a short list of games that I have been wanting to play for the podcast. Do you want to play? Okay, so let's think about this. Do you want to play a game that has been like already tested and loved by the community, or one that's potentially like untested and that I don't really know about? Because I have like maybe 4 or 5 games, and some of them are like big games that like people really really like and they're
Okay.
beloved,
Are,
or not in that category. Like we don't really know what this game's about.
do the beloved games give me a chance to take a needlessly contrary position? Can I hate them for the sake of hating them?
Actually, I feel like one of those is yes.
Okay.
I feel like one of those is a definite yes.
All right. Here's what I'll say then. Either pick a game that we can, pick a beloved game that we, or at least I, can take a new perspective on, right? Something where we're not just going to be like, this is great. Let's talk about why it's great. Or pick one we all know about. It'll
All
make it
right.
interesting.
Well, I also could have us play a game that is a multiplayer game. We could play together.
Ugh.
No?
No, I hate playing with you guys.
All right. I'm really torn now because it's down to 2. Should we just
Listen,
name them?
I don't think you can just name them, but let me just say I don't think next week's going to be our last podcast. All right, we've been doing this for a while.
Right.
We have time to play them both.
You're right. Okay, then I'm gonna play a game that's kind of new, and I'll take the one that I think is twee, the one that you maybe will have a bone to pick with
Nice.
later. I want to play a game called Dead Cells.
Dead Cell, 2 words?
Dead Cells.
Okay.
It's relatively new. It's sort of like a roguelike game. Dead Cells is it's also sort of like an action platformer, kind of like Valda's Story, but it's
Game of the Year,
roguelike in
Valda's
that,
Story?
yeah, Game of the Year Valda's Story.
Gotcha.
I mean, it's super well loved by the community right now. Everyone's talking about Dead Cells. It came out just a couple months ago, I think in May.
Okay.
So it's relatively new. Our friend John, who played Valda's Story, he wasn't really into it, says that for him, Dead Cells is what Valda's Story was supposed to be the whole time.
All right, man, you got me on board. I'm intrigued. I like the title. It sounds good.
Yeah, it should be a lot of fun. That's going to be the game that I want to talk about next. I might actually see if John wants to jump in and talk about it with us because I think he would really enjoy it. But that's going to be my pick. We're going to talk about Dead Cells for our next Deep Listens podcast. Be sure to check out our Persona 5 experience podcast. Those are going to be coming out periodically in
Great
between
game,
these.
by the way, too.
Great game so
Persona
far. I'm really
series,
having a
great
fun
series.
time. I would say if you want to get in touch with the show, you can do so via our social media. Our plug is at DeepListensPod. You can also send us an email at deeplistenspodcast@gmail.com. You can write us a review, leave comments on our main hosting page, which is deeplistens.libsyn.com. There's also some other sites that we're hosting the podcast on. Not sure all of them. Gino would know that better than I would. But you can also hit us up like on iTunes and 5-star us and write reviews or comments. So any of those things would be great. We love to hear from the community, and we love forcing Gino to read all of your hilarious comments and shenanigans. So, Pete, any final thoughts?
Just everybody make sure you tune in to the next one. If you loved today's format, me and Billy will be back again next time. And if you hated it, Gino will be back again hopefully next time. So, maybe it'll come back around on you.
Great. I mean, you basically cannot lose.
Win-win, man. Win-win.
Mm-hmm. You're either going to get more Billy and Pete, or you're going to get the return of Gino, And if those are what you're looking for, that's an exhaustive list. So
That's it. You got them.
you definitely got it. So that's it for me. Thanks everybody. My name is Billy Rothard, aka Rothgar. Thanks for tuning in. Look forward to seeing you guys next week for the Persona podcast, and then after that for Dead Cells. So, till next time, peace.